Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Poison Pen in Scottsdale, Arizona, and to the book launch for The President's Daughter by Bill Clinton and James Patterson, their second collaboration after their best-selling The President is Missing. We do have, thanks to their kindness, and thank you, gentlemen, Mr. Patterson and Mr. Clinton, extra signed copies, and Patrick is putting the link in the comments field should you wish to click on it, and buy a copy. We'd be delighted, and so would the authors. Our host for tonight is Lee Child, author of 25 Jack Reacher thrillers and a 26th, Better Off Dead, will publish on October 26th, when we'll see Lee back at the Poison Pen with his brother Andrew. We've known Lee, and he's worked with us since his first Jack Reacher, Killing Floor, and we know him to be an engaging, enthusiastic supporter of his fans and other authors, and I know him to be loaded with perspicacious questions. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Lee Child. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, I'm with two gentlemen tonight who require no introduction at all, so I'm not going to introduce them because I hate it when people say, here's somebody who requires no introduction, and then they spend the next 15 minutes introducing them, which means that you lose 15 minutes of talking time, which is what we're here for tonight. So suffice it to say, I'm here with Bill Clinton and Jim Patterson, and we're talking about The President's Daughter, almost exactly 3 years to the day since we did an event together in Philadelphia for the first book, The President is Missing. So here we are, the band is back together to discuss that difficult second album. And so let's hear about it. I remember from 3 years ago, you said that your mutual lawyer and agent, Bob Barnett, talked you into doing the collaboration. And now I've read the new book, and to prove how much attention I pay to it, I'm going to quote from the dedication, not even the text, where you say that Mr. Barnett twisted your arm into doing this follow-up. Is that right? Why would you need enticement? It was such fun. It was such a great book the first time. Is it true that you needed enticement, or did you know you were always going to do it?
We were just playing with Barnett, but go ahead, Mr. President.
Well, I think, I wanted to do it because I learned so much. As you know, the first time I met you on the street in Chappaqua, New York, Lee, I told you I'd read every one of the Reacher books, and that's still true. And I've been fascinated with the whole genre for 40 plus years, and I wanted to do it. I was excited. This time, I was frankly worried that we wouldn't match the first, but Jim had this germ of an idea that we should do it with the former president. And I also have some 20 years of experience with that, and have a family member kidnapped. And then we backed the plot up from that to make it interesting and also informative about recent American history and dealing with terrorists and problems abroad. And so it just sort of grew.
Well, Lee, with the first book, The President is Missing, we really dealt with an incredibly serious problem that a president might face. And now we're seeing a lot about cybersecurity. The first book, The President is Missing, it really deals with that. And we always felt, or the president and I felt that hopefully it won't turn out as badly as some people predict it will. But it's a real a problem that a president would face. In the case of the new book, it's let's deal with the president in terms of his humanity. And if you think about a family member being kidnapped, whether it's your wife or your son or daughter or your brother, it's such a serious thing. So we can really humanize this president and write a very emotional book. So we like that idea, and that's a big difference in terms of the two books.
Yeah, which I mean, you call it a germ of an idea. It's more like an ice pick of an idea, because I think by my philosophy about it is it's don't write what you know, write what you feel. And there can be no worse feeling. And by coincidence, I think all three of us have got just one kid. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My daughter Ruth is almost exactly the same age as Chelsea. And so we know what it's like to have one kid. And that idea that they could disappear is just horrible. So it was an incredibly emotional charge to the idea of the book. And in some ways, almost unbearable, really tense. The president said he hoped the second one came out as good as the first. Actually, I think it's way better than the first. I think this is a really terrific thriller. And I want to go back to what you said about reading for 40 years, because to me, as a thriller nerd, this was written by people who know this genre so intimately. Now, obviously, Jim Patterson knows it really well because he's been doing it all his life. But you could put this book in a time capsule as this is a thriller in 2021, because it just hit every note. And that's got to come from vast reading experience, surely.
Well, maybe. I think it does. But also I think it comes from Jim's experience about how to knit all these different ideas that we have together. And I think everybody can identify with that. If you had a child in trouble, and if you knew she got in trouble because of something you had done when you were president, and you still had the contacts and the skill set to do something about it, and you were estranged from the current occupant of the White House, if you could, wouldn't you do it? Crazy as it seems, and unlikely as it seems, if it happened, we think this is the way it would happen, as Jim always says.
Yeah. Well, that's what separates us. I mean, if something of this ilk, whether it's a wife or some relative of a president or former president was taken, it would dominate the airwaves for weeks until it was resolved somehow. And Bob Woodward would then write a book, and they'd sell 1 million copies in the first day of that book. This book is kind of like that in the sense that if something horrifying like this happened, here's how it would happen. Here's what would take place if a president had to, if it happened to a president. Imagine one of these kidnapping things, but the president has all the resources of his office to deal with it. Former president doesn't have as many, but he still has a lot of contacts, and he's going to use all of them. And that's what happens in The President's Daughter. He uses every contact he can possibly make use of. As you would, I think you're going to do everything that's humanly possible.
Of course, yeah. And that was my next question. That the first book, The Politics, was internal inside the White House. And this book is after the president has left the White House. And therefore, the constraints are there, the resources are fewer. But President Clinton is, 2.5 times longer being an ex-president than you were an actual president. And I was really interested in, is that real, that you would have felt you could call up this guy or that guy, or, head of intelligence overseas or something like that, and gotten that kind of response?
Well, you could call your friends overseas, like this guy calls, people in intelligence in foreign countries that he had contacts with, and I think they would level with you. There are unique circumstances that the book lays out in the beginning about how this guy came to be a former president and what his relationship with the current president and her chief of staff, who's also her husband, is, which makes him feel, shall we say, not guilty about trying to do what he can to get his daughter back. And that's more unlikely, but if you look at the strains that existed in America in the last 4 years, or before the 2020 election between the existing administration and all the previous administrations. It's not entirely impossible to consider.
Good. Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that it is at least plausible. Because that was, it would have been really no story at all if the guy had still been president because of the massive power that he would have had. And it was those limitations that, did you feel that? I mean, not in these serious ways, but just in every way, when you did not have the support that you'd had for 8 years, was it weird? Was it, did it take some getting used to?
A little bit. I always joke that for the first 3 weeks I was out of office, I didn't know where I was because no one played a song anymore. I walked in the room, and you do keep Secret Service, but adult children lose it unless there is some overwhelming emergency. You can't even conceive it would happen. So if your child is at risk, then you have to try to find some other way of dealing with it, like private security or whatever. And so you feel that. It was unusual for me because 9/11 happened after I left office. But as I said, bin Laden had a fatwa out on me because I almost got him once. And he knew what we were trying to do. And also, frankly, a lot of those people got in America before 9/11 and before I left office. And so there are all kinds of questions about that we had to deal with. And then, as you will see in the book, there are other people involved who had resentments against this president for other reasons that sort of coincided with the kidnappers. And I think that's really interesting because that's factually true, that part.
When we started to consider writing another book, we went through a few ideas, and then when we sort of got interested in this one in particular, we started going through the outline. And one of the things that was attracted to both of us was writing about a former president, which I'm sure it's been done before, but not too often. And it certainly was, because obviously, the President Clinton deals with it every day now. So that was another emotional thing for us to really build into the core of this story.
Yeah, I guess it's a modern phenomenon now, really, that presidents have an afterlife after office. You were very young as president, and for instance, Obama probably even younger. And so you've got decades after the White House. And I guess you live with this stuff forever because people have long memories. I just read a book about the Northern Irish situation where that already goes back more than 50 years, and people are still passionately disputing with each other and maintaining silence and maintaining grudges from then. So I guess it lasts for the rest of your life.
Well, a lot of us have a second, I just did a book, Walk in Your Combat Boots, which is about, a part of it at least, is vets coming back from the war and having to get another mission. But a lot of us go through this all the time. People retire. They need to get another mission. Athletes retire very young. They need to get another mission. There's so many areas where the kids leave home. We need another mission. So a lot of us can identify with that second life or third life. What are we going to do now? Who are we?
Yeah, one of the things that I found difficult about the book, I have to say, is once the threat of any kind of terrorist action against me kind of ebbed. And I really always prided myself. I started thinking about it in my second term as president. I said, when I walk out of here, I don't want to spend a day wishing I could still do this. I want to be grateful for the chance I had to serve. And then I want to live in the present and for the future. And that's why you mentioned athletes. That's why I admire Magic Johnson so much. He left the game a few years before he would have had he not contracted AIDS. And but he thought a lot about what he wanted to do, and he went out and did what he wanted to do, and he's still involved in athletics, but he's still in his life and thinking of the future. I think that's the most healthy thing to do. So this guy, one of the things we really tried to write about here is that, because this happens shortly after he leaves office, is he was thinking about the future. He was trying to figure out how he was going to live, what his wife was going to do, how she was going to pursue her long deferred career. They were trying to put together a future oriented life, and events prevented it.
So another thing in the dedication was a mention of Brendan Dubois, who's a good friend of mine, and I had no idea. What was he, like some kind of project manager whipping you all along or something?
There's a little of that whipping, a little research, a little helping with the writing. Brendan and we're very close. He's in witness protection up in New Hampshire. He's a great guy. And we've done a few books together now. We're doing another one now about it's another kind of presidential thing, but a really weird one.
He's
he's very talented, and he got this whole deal right away. I mean, he saw what we were trying to do, which helped.
Sure. He's the best short story writer I know. His short stories are fantastic.
Well, that's how we met, because I was doing the book shots, which were novellas, and all of a sudden I had to do 3 a month, and I needed co-writers. And to me, you have to figure out stuff yourself. And so I went there. Every year there best American short stories, and I just started reading them. And I went, this guy, this woman, this guy, this woman, because they could write scenes. And I read something Brendan had written called The End, which is a very, very good, long short story, but very, very good. And I said, this guy is really good. I called him up, and we started writing together. First short stuff, and then a little longer. The Summer House is one that we did together, which I think is a really good.
Really good.
Yeah, I think it turned out well.
So for this one, it must have been written during the pandemic, I'm assuming, and so a distance relationship, presumably sending stuff back and forth. And how did it? I mean, I know that from a writer's point of view, pandemic was not usually a problem because writers are usually isolated and alone anyway. But for you, Mr. President, I mean, what a completely bizarre year. How did you feel about it? How did you react to it? What did you actually do?
Well, I stayed home, except the only times I left until last week. I finally went to New York and had dinner with a friend outside in one of those clear canister-like things, but it was good. But before that, I went to, Hillary and I voted in the Electoral College, and then we went to the inauguration. And otherwise, I went to John Lewis's funeral and to Hank Aaron's funeral and to Vernon Jordan's funeral and to Cicely Tyson's funeral. And I went home to a family member's funeral, and that was it. But I've had Chelsea and Mark and our 3 grandchildren next door in our guest house for 15 months. So I perfected my grandparenting skills, which was a gift. And otherwise I just worked, and I was determined to do what our foundation could do. So we did some work in New York and a lot of work in Arkansas, feeding hungry people and things like that. And our health initiative worked in the World Health Organization to try to help them improve on the previous problem with Ebola. And so I stayed busy, but this gave some shape to my life. I mean, it really gave me something to think about that took my mind off of just fretting or just playing with my grandkids. And we did it like we did before. We agreed on an outline. And then I got my research request. Jim would give me, this is what I need to know. This is what you need to know. We need to work in the college. So I did that. He wrote a couple of chapters. Then we just switched drafts back and forth. And the story really carried itself through very well. And then along toward the end, we had some loose ends we had to tie up. And so we agreed on what the loose ends were and how they'd be tied. And we finished the book. It was great. I loved doing it.
Yeah, one of the things that the president, this happens, is true of both books. He does push me in a good way to keep adding depth to the characters, and that's not necessarily one of my strengths, but it's a good thing, and he's very helpful in terms of the characters being more rounded, which I think that's a good thing. It's a good thing to come, in terms of one of the things that makes these books stand out.
You got to have a good guy and a bad guy and a plot. I understand that. And in politics, it's usually reported as, or often reported as if all the main players are pretty two-dimensional. You know, they're heroes or bums or assets or liabilities or whatever. But actually, I've found in life, if you scratch most people hard enough, there's still a person down there somewhere. And I think if you can make the person real, even the characters that are doing the wrong things, in our case, it's better. It feels, it feels like the experiences people have in other areas of their lives.
I really felt the joy and the fun that you were feeling while you were doing it. That really comes across. And is it a liberation to do fiction for you? Because most of your stuff is nonfiction, and certainly the foundation obviously is, that's real world stuff that you got to do correctly and data driven and all that kind of thing. So is it a liberation to abandon yourself to fiction?
Yes, and in some ways, because it's people just read what you write, you can say what you believe in clear terms, and in some ways you may have more influence on the way people think about things than you can in nonfiction.
Absolutely. I mean,
people bring so much baggage to nonfiction books, particularly by political figures.
Yeah, and I do a fair amount of nonfiction now, which I enjoy. But what I don't like about it is I can't make stuff up.
Yeah, exactly. I know. And I've tried it as well. I've done, I did one solid nonfiction thing, which was for an exoneration project. And it came out pretty good, but I felt exactly what you just said. It would be better if it happened like this. Why can't I just make it up? But who was it who said the difference between fiction and nonfiction is that fiction has to make sense? And so, yeah, and that's what I've been trying to tell people for years. You can learn a lot more from fiction than you can from nonfiction because there's an emotional truth to it. There's an emotional through line to it that ultimately can teach you more because it makes you think along with the character.
But you mentioned what you did for the Exoneration Project. This book that Jim wrote on it was literally a series of stories out of the mouths of men and women who had served in uniform. And they were gripping. So I think when a fiction writer who's really good decides to tell a story that's worthwhile, that's true, the fiction writer is more likely than people who do this all the time to make the characters come alive. And you can do it in their own voice. I mean, I used to say that I thought almost everybody was inherently interesting, but they couldn't tell their own story very well.
Yeah. Well, that was the deal when I did Walk in My Combat Boots with the vets, and every one of them would go like, I don't have anything to tell you. And then you read this thing and every one of them has a mind blower of a story, every one of them. And I just finished one on emergency room nurses, and that's even more gripping and powerful because what emergency room nurses do is unbelievable, unbelievable.
Sure.
One of the best things that came out of this pandemic was the appreciation that I think Americans have, without regard to their politics, for the vast majority of these public health workers who are out there sticking their necks out, putting their lives on the line. And even if they didn't look like them or think like them or vote like them, their raw courage and devotion came through. And that's what comes through in this Combat Boots book, too.
Yeah. And you know, what the president is missing and the president's daughter, they're not political books. They basically set up, you know, a good human being at the top, and it doesn't matter. I mean, I think we all can go, yeah, that's what we want. We want a good human being.
Yeah,
I'm not making comments on who's in or out or whatever, but you know, I think most of us can agree on that.
yeah, it's completely neutral as to party. I don't think it even specifies which party anybody is from. It is a sort of, I love to read it because it was so reassuring. It was almost nostalgic. You know,
That's unfortunate.
it is unfortunate, but at least you laid down a blueprint for maybe what we could get back to eventually.
It's a prayer, man. It's a prayer.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not going to obviously mention what happens in the book because that is kind of annoying, but there is a sensational reveal and reversal in the middle. Sensational. That is, people are gonna freak when they get up to about page 360 something, I think. And it harks back to what I said before. This is a classic thriller in its structure and its execution. And it led me to want to ask, going back in the past, what were those highlights, that thriller highlights that you would love to have matched or maybe even exceeded?
You mean other people? I mean, Day of the Jackal and Exorcist were the two that got me. I was kind of a, you know, in college, typical literary snob. And I read those two books and I went, wow, there's something there. And I'm not capable of doing 100 Years of Solitude, which I'd like to do. 100 years of, what am I saying? Yeah. And, but I read those two and I went, wow, I like these. These are cool. This is interesting. Day of the Jackal in particular, especially when it came out, it was kind of a mind bender. Nobody had done anything quite.
I agree. It was a sort of year zero thriller for me. And, you know, it's 50 years old this year. They hired me to write the introduction for the 50th anniversary edition. And going back over it, yeah, that was a game changer of a book. What about you, Mr. President? What have you got in, you know, going back to college, I guess, when you were reading for pleasure, if you ever did? What stands out from those historic giants?
I think there's never been a really good thriller which explains the presidential election of 1876, which was decided by one electoral vote as a result of a commission that was appointed to review disputes in, believe it or not, Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, and a couple of other states. And there was all this stuff going on in the background. And the publisher of the New York Times was incredibly involved in the maneuvering that wound up giving Rutherford B. Hayes the vote he needed to become president. But the price they paid was to remove the Union forces from the South before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had become embedded in the fabric of life. So immediately, all the gains in civil rights were reversed, and all these terrible things happened. And yet there were these remarkable Black Americans who were still trying to do things. There's a great little history on Justice John Marshall Harlan, who was the dissenting vote in Plessy v. Ferguson and a lot of these other cases, sticking up for civil rights. And it was because he was extremely close to a Black man named Robert Harlan, who served in the Ohio legislature before and who had grown up as a slave with his father in his father's house. And that's interesting to me. The maneuvering Richard Nixon did before the 1968 election to try to make sure that the Paris peace talks failed, which is a major violation of American law, really. The Logan Act says that no president can have his own, no non-president can pursue a foreign policy different from the president's. But it's hard to enforce because, you know, if you're openly and publicly having a difference, that's not the same thing. But I mean, he maneuvered with Madame Chiang-Kai-shek to kill the Paris peace talks to make sure that there would be no peace by the time he became president. And President Johnson found out about it because they were keeping tabs on other people and they uncovered the evidence. And he decided, for reasons still more or less lost to history, not to tell it. And whether it would have changed the outcome, I don't know, but it was a very close election. Mostly, though, because of George Wallace, because he got such a big third-party vote.
You know, the other area, Lee, we bring up like novels that, you know, are the characters. You know, I mean, for me, not to, you know, but Reacher is one of those characters. I can't wait to see him again. Mike Connolly has a couple, a limousine lawyer and Bosch. John Sanford has a couple of just characters that I can't wait to read the next one, to meet up with that character again.
I always feel
So
when I'm
if
reading
you
a
had
book,
asked me what I thought you were going to ask me, which is that I wish I were that ex-president, I said, no, I wish I were Jack Reacher. That's who I want to be when I grow up. Just get on a bus and stop and keep bad things from happening.
it's a great life. So how do you actually feel when you read a novel or see a movie or TV with a president in it or with politics in it? Because you're legendary for absolutely obsessive, detailed knowledge of politics down to the precinct level. And obviously we have to cut writers some slack, but do you think fictional representations of politics in the presidency are any good? Have there been really good ones? Any really bad ones?
And a lot of bad.
I thought the president and Scandal was good. In that series, he looked weak, then he looked strong, but at least he was three-dimensional. I thought it was very interesting. Mm-hmm. I thought Martin Sheen was good in The West Wing. And I thought The West Wing succeeded where Madam President didn't, where Gina Davis played the first woman president, because they could make realistic episodes because they were dealing with an ensemble, all the people that work in the White House. You couldn't, it wasn't 6 episodes into Madam President before there were things that you just couldn't imagine happening because everything was focused on her, and it was too much of a burden to bear. If you want it to be realistic, you can have, like we do in this novel and the former one, you can have big things happen, but not every week like that.
Right.
So,
and the other piece, Lee, is so many of, and I think we'll watch a movie and we'll go, there's something almost plastic about a lot of the presidents in TV shows or movies or whatever. And, you know, and if you've met, I mean, you know, President Clinton and I have spent a fair amount of time together now, and I know him as a human being. And that's what's missing from a lot of these portrayals. They're human beings. They're just human. There's some greatness. There's some flaws. There's some, you know, and I think that's what we tried to do with both of these presidents in the 2 books that we've done. They're human. They make mistakes. They do good things. You know.
I agree with that. I think one of the appeals that President Biden has is that he seems like a normal person who cares about the kind of things you care about.
Right.
And I thought Daniel Day-Lewis did a hell of a job as Lincoln because he wasn't too prissy to get involved in politics. The deals he had to make to get the 13th Amendment passed were unbelievable. So would you rather it not have passed? I mean, you know, he was a person, and his craft was politics. And the difference in politics and art is that you can pick your mode of expression, you can pick your paints. In politics, they give you the elements, and then you have to make something out of it, and you either do or you don't. So it's interesting. I appreciate what Jim said, but I think that's right.
I don't know how Jim feels, but when I see a writer or in a book or on the in the movies, that's usually pretty bad. You know, we're either drunk all the time or else we're screwing up pieces of paper and missing getting them in the trash. And
Well, we have preconceptions, don't we?
yeah, we do, and it's nothing like reality for us. So that's why I was so interested. It's interesting what you say about West Wing, because you've got the ensemble sense, but you also got the passion and the enthusiasm of the ensemble. Like, yeah, of course they knew they were faced with all kinds of difficulties, but they were trying to do the right thing, and that was inspiring in itself.
But you know, the other thing about President Clinton is he recognizes structurally what was right with the West Wing and what was wrong with the Gina Davis thing, why it couldn't work.
Right.
And that's what storytellers do.
But one of the things that's important is the president has to recognize that it's you may be the face and the voice, and you may get the credit and the blame, but you're something that big. You're toast if you don't have a good cabinet and a good White House staff. And if you do, it's something that'll carry you forever. The other day I did a Zoom with Leon Panetta, who, you know, was President Obama's defense secretary and CIA chief, but he was my chief of staff and head of OMB. And, you know, he's in his 80s now and still vigorous, and I just love to talk to him. I did a Zoom with Bill Perry, who's well into his 90s now, who I think was one of the greatest defense secretaries this country ever had. And we talked about what we did. And the other day, I did one with 210 alumni of the administration who were all very, very young when they worked for me. And God, they're just still so full of energy and so full of passion and belief because that experience made them feel that it mattered. And I think that's important. You know, one of the things that the president has to do is to make other people feel that they matter.
Uh-huh. So the reason why he is a former president in this book is that not that he was defeated in a general election after one term, but that he was primaried by his VP. And I'm assuming that was not a fear you had with Al Gore at any point. Has that ever happened?
No, it was, but as you know, the president, the former president, our hero in this book, along with his daughter, he became president because he was vice president and the president died young. Yeah. So he picked the woman who had run second to the president in the primaries, thinking she would be grateful. And it didn't work out that well, partly for all kinds of reasons, but you have to be careful. Harry Truman once said, if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. But that's not quite true. There are a lot of people who are quite loyal to each other, if when a vice president runs for president, if he runs right afterward, like Al Gore did, you've got to say what you want to continue and what will be different. So a lot of vice presidents have been caught in a psychological bind, and George Bush was one of only 2 vice presidents to ascend directly to the presidency when he won. And he did it, Bush 41, by saying that he wanted a kinder, gentler nation, which was basically, I'm not going to abandon Reaganomics and trickle-down economics will stay, and I really don't believe the government can do as much as the Democrats do. They're going to do too much, but I'll be kinder and gentler around the edges that are now too rough. And that was enough to get him over once they had made Governor Dukakis seem unacceptable. And so that's a dilemma. You got to be sensitive to that. And so the tensions between the former president and the president in this book were well in evidence when they were in office together. He was never under any illusion that she was particularly grateful to him for making her vice president.
Yeah, that was a great relationship in the book, and she was there was so many factions. Obviously, Keating and his situation. There was the new President Barnes and her administration. There was obviously the bad guys who had kidnapped the daughter. In a classic ABC role thing where, you know, meanwhile, back at the ranch, this is happening. The good guys are doing this, the bad guys are doing that. But there was a fourth character in there, which was essentially China, which was shown as somehow always watching, always involved in everything. And again, I'm assuming that is real. You know, the biggest problem for thriller writers in my generation was the collapse of the Soviet Union, because without the KGB, where is the huge opponent?
Oh, but they're back. They're back.
Yeah. Yeah, we had that. To remember, we had that interregnum for a while. There was just nobody, and I remember Gerald Seymour from the UK wrote about the Balkans or Kosovo or so on, and that was not enough. Nothing works without the huge, powerful opponent, and China is the one in this book. Really fascinating to me, that was.
Yes, but if you notice, we wrote it in a way that the biggest Chinese player is basically going beyond his remit from the Chinese government too. So we tried to make sure people understood that they're, even in monolithic societies or monolithic governments, there's still fissures there that are caused by the scars of earlier life. And I hope that's interesting to people.
I think one of the hard things actually would be to write about that monolith, though, and make it interesting to people. I mean, philosophically, it's interesting, but in terms of, you know, chapter after chapter and characters, I think that's difficult.
Yeah, the Chinese character was a maverick, essentially, operating a little unauthorized, a little undercover with an agenda of his own, and that introduced yet more tension, because that gave him his own conflict and his own peril, which in fact, in the end, didn't do him many favors. He was in trouble a lot of the book himself.
Yep.
Right.
But that happens all the time. You know, if in any administration, there's going to be some people who are disaffected. And what I tried to do was to tell the people who work for me that they would never be isolated or driven out or demoted for disagreeing with me. And if they came in the Oval Office, we were in a decision-making process, and they said, "I think you are full of bull, and here's why," that I would respect them, because you don't want people intimidated. Otherwise, you can just run the thing by a computer. Get yourself artificial intelligence and ride on. So, but I said, if we make a decision and you can't live with it, don't backstab us. Don't just go leaking all over and saying things that may or may not be true and making a bunch of extra work for us dealing with this. Just resign, and I will praise you. Tell them you're resigning because you disagree with me. I will praise you, and I will recommend you for any other job. And I tried to create this idea that we were part of a band trying to do something, and if they thought I made the wrong decision, they were free to go, and I would lift them up if I could, but don't backstab us. And that you do the best you can with that, but it's really important in politics.
The other thing that you two have in common is a passion for literacy and how that is going to improve people's lives. I think Jim is magnificent for that. I mean, really not only puts the time and the effort into it, but also the money. I mean, that is a superbly generous initiative. And I assume we can all agree that the more people that read, the healthier the society is. But I remember when your autobiography came out, you invited me to the launch party at the Metropolitan Museum. And in your speech, you said, whoever you are, even if you can barely write at all, you should write a page or two about your life and your mom and dad and your grandparents. Even if it's awful, just write it, because that becomes valuable to your family later. And I was very impressed by that. And I wish that more people did it. I obviously wish more people read, but I also wish more people wrote in that way. So much family stuff just disappears, which is history
And,
disappearing.
that can be done in every classroom in the country.
Yep. But I mean,
It
I
really
really believe that. I think if you could convince everybody to just tell their family story, it would make a difference, and it would help us to relate better to each other. I just read, you both probably, excuse me. I just read the Isabel Wilkerson's great book, Caste.
Mhm.
And she talks about how we've been imprisoned by it, and she compares the race in America with the caste system in India and what the Nazis tried to do before they started gassing people, just when they were building their political thing. But at the end of the book, she tells a story about a guy that came to her house to fix a leak or to look at it. And he was a white guy who was obviously a big Trump supporter, and he wasn't so happy about being there. And he wouldn't help her move stuff around in the basement, expose the pipes, and he was just like this. And then she said, well, I've got to save these. These are letters from my mother. And he saw a picture. And he said, have you lost her? She says, yes, I lost my mother, and I lost my husband, and I lost a child. And she was telling the story. So he starts talking about his family and what he's been through. And before you know it, he's moving everything for her, and he's checking things 4 or 5 times, and he fixes what can be fixed. And the next day he comes back and finds out exactly what's wrong and tells her what has to be done there. And I mean, and all of a sudden they're people to each other. And I think when the family story is something, I wish we could convince millions of people to write 10, 20, 30, 40 pages.
We can do it, man. We just need to get the schools doing it. They can do it in the schools. Every kid could be doing that. There's so many things that there's so much time that's wasted in school. That would be a really useful thing to do. Teach, get them writing and get them reading, because we still have the situation in this country where only 45% of the kids are reading at grade level in this country, which is a disgrace. And we can actually solve that right now. We have the vaccine. But the states won't use the vaccine, which is nuts.
Well, Jim, your line is that there really is nobody who does not like to read. It's just that they have not yet found the right book.
Yep, that's a problem for sure. Yeah, you have millions of kids in this country who've never read one book that they like. And there are plenty of books that they would like. But once again, it's the schools. The schools need to help more. It's not their fault. There's a lot of reasons why things happen, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine there's all kind of bureaucracy about what is going to be set as a set book. But I think that absolutely, if even once a year they could read something that they absolutely love, then it gets them into the habit of expecting pleasure from a book instead of expecting a pain.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so many things about English, you got to learn all the rules, blah, blah. You got to make it fun and interesting and rewarding for kids too. Every kid they should leave school going, you know what, I loved English class. And they ought to do the same thing with history. I loved history. They don't have to memorize everything in the history. What the president just memorized it. He just reads stuff and it's automatically, he memorizes it. But for a lot of people, it's torture. Then it shouldn't be torture. School should not be torture.
No, it should not. So, of course, the other recent ex-president who's a famously big reader was President Obama. Do the two of you swap recommendations? Do you talk about books?
You know, we haven't. I probably should, because he always, I read his recommendations. You know, every year or so, he and I will, you know, recommend books in certain categories, and it's on the internet. So I always look at what he's reading and see if I've read it or should read it.
Well, if you get a chance, recommend mine, because I met him at a fundraiser, and he was very straightforward. He said, "I haven't read any of your books."
Yeah, I
And
don't think he's a big
I,
fiction guy.
I said, "Yeah, you've probably got other things to do." But now he's got time on his hands.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Cool.
He doesn't know what he's missing.
So I can't emphasize enough how well this came out. I mean, it was at the beginning of the show, I said the difficult second album, and actually it was really good. So much better. I think better than the first one. It was like you were practice, or maybe it was what we talked about before, the idea of limitation on the president. Are you going to do a third one? That is what we need to know.
I don't know. We weren't going to do a second one necessarily. I think we're kind of in that same space. You will have to see if a story appeals to us. We like to hang out together, so that's fun.
Yeah,
we
well,
do. And I must say, I feel selfish because I learn so much when we do it. You know, and I see all the time I'm reading these drafts and we're going back and forth, and I'm saying, you know, I wish I'd have, in my real life, in my former life, or in a nonfiction book I wrote, I wish I'd have said it this way. I mean, it's really been exhilarating for me. And you know, if we can think of a good subject, maybe we'll do it. But let's see how this one does.
Yeah. They might not want us back. Who knows?
yeah.
The other thing about it, I mean, look, I grew up in this little, well, we both did. We both, you know, initially grew up in little towns, and it's stunning to me. And I think this is a gift that I can spend some time with the President Clinton, or spend some time with Lee Child. And I find it really exhilarating, because this guy, this punk, this young guy from Newburgh, it's like, damn, this is very cool. And I can appreciate it. And the way I raised our son is, it's no big deal. So I sell a bunch of books. Who cares? So it's just not a big deal.
Yeah, I feel that exactly the same as you. I look back on that lost and lonely little kid from Birmingham, England, and I look around me now and I think, you know, you did okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And from Hope, Arkansas, the same thing. Although I was extremely, I was expecting you to take up the saxophone again when you left the White House, because the story is you were not just an amateur player, you were pretty good.
Yeah, I was. At one time I was pretty good, but that's one of my few regrets in the last 20 years. But in the first years, particularly, I was working, you know, back-breaking hours, you know, long hours, and lots and lots of trips. And I still play a little bit. Every now and then I'll play my grandchildren tune or something, but I haven't entirely given up on going back to it. It just takes a while to build up your embouchure. You know, you need strong lips and proper breathing technique, and so I may go back to it. I loved it. When I was young, I was so happy I could play. I used to go to summer camp in high school and play 12 hours a day. I played literally until my lips would bleed. Uh-huh. And but it spoils you, because then you don't want to be just a total hack, you know, you're playing. As a guy once said to me, who was a gifted musician, he said, I hope you get back out there, but he said, you don't want to sound like you can't play Come to Jesus in whole notes.
Was it a tenor or alto?
Tenor.
Cool.
I have an alto, and a beautiful one from 1955. It's a French alto, and I also have a straight soprano saxophone made by Adolph Sax.
Oh.
And a tenor made by Sax. Only 14 years after the very first one was ever built in the 1800s. And like, I think the first one was built in 1849 and mine was built in 1863. But it plays like a dream. But it's a different horn than we have today.
Sure.
I mean, the metal's thinner. So if you put a metal mouthpiece on this horn that Sachs made to be in orchestral settings as well as for military bands, I mean, children would run screaming from the room.
Yeah. Adolf Sachs, he designed it for the orchestra. He thought it was going to be a classical instrument.
Yes, he
He
did.
had no idea how it would end up. There's always a good name to remember when you play that game, 10 Famous Belgians. What about you, Jim?
Not Belgium.
Jim, what about you and hobbies? Have you got I mean, you're too busy, I assume, too hardworking and productive, but what do you do if you get time off?
I really do. Somebody said you're lucky if you find something you like to do, and then it's a miracle if somebody will pay you to do it. And so I love to scribble, and I scribble 7 days a week. I'm very close to the family, which is nice. The tragic flaw is I do golf very early in the mornings, like at 6:30 to 7. Huh? Yeah, I have 8 holes in one. So whatever. That's a tragic thing that I do.
That's an extraordinary number for an amateur golfer.
It is.
Yeah.
His wife's a better golfer than he is, but he gets more holes than one. Patterson figures out whatever game he's playing, he figures out how to score.
Yeah.
I've learned that the hard way, including having arguments or anything.
He likes that number one. That's for sure. And I'm sure this book is going to go straight to number one. I do remember we're talking about your autobiography. I came to that thing at the Met, and I actually knew a guy who worked security at the Met, and he sneaked me in the side entrance before anybody else, so I didn't have to line up. And I met Sonny Mehta in there, who was a publisher of Knopf, who we lost recently. And he was pacing up and down, looking really tense. And I said, Sonny, don't worry, this is great. This is a triumph. And he said, we haven't sold a single copy yet. And, like it was out the next day and it did fine. But so I'm sure this one will. But it is very significant to me that both of you said, we'll see how it does. In other words, taking nothing for granted, which I think is the only realistic way of going about things.
Yeah.
Also, you just don't know what'll work and what won't,
Well, this one will.
I don't worry about it, but it's just, advice I got way back in my hippie stage from the one of these guys who came over from India. Make no appointments, have no disappointments. Good advice.
This has really been a fascinating discussion. May I ask one question that for the two of you that comes up at virtually every virtual event we do? That's a terrible sentence. Why couldn't I find a better adjective? In any case, people are always interested in how people write together. And Jim, you've written with a lot of other people, most of them authors, but recently with your nonfiction, you've been writing or at least listening to stories from people who are not authors. How did you and President Clinton come to collaborate? And is it a different process with working with him than with any of your other authors?
I think it's a little different in theory, but not in practice. And at the point, if it really came to it, and it never has, he would get the final vote, in my opinion. But it's never come that way. And I think the reason it works, and I think we both agree on this, is there's mutual respect. And we listen, and that's the biggest thing. We listen, and that's in dealing with Hollywood, I find that people don't listen out there. They just don't listen, especially the writers. They don't listen, which is crazy to me.
So, President Clinton, you've written your own work, obviously. I have a copy of your autobiography behind me. How does working with Jim, how is it different for you? You said you've enjoyed it and you've learned a lot, but what does that really mean?
Well, in some ways, it's much easier because the way we start. We just have an outline, which is the same way I wrote that book, and we agree on the outline. But you can't possibly foresee, I think, when you start writing a thriller, at least it's been our experience, exactly what every nook and cranny will be, what leads you open up in character development and in plot twists that then you have to close at the end. So I thought it was easier because when we started, Jim drafted a couple of chapters and I did the research that I was supposed to do in both books, and then I would read it and make suggestions, and and we'd go back and forth and back and forth. In some ways it's harder because I don't want to let him down, and I was so afraid I would, because I was
I'm a big fan of outlines, and some readers are, some readers aren't. But we're never a slave to the outline, because you just don't, you're writing something and all of a sudden there's a twist that comes up and it changes everything, or one character starts going off in their own direction and you're liking where they're going and you weren't expecting, or a villain becomes really interesting to you. You don't want to knock them off at the end, or her. So, yeah.
You never can tell. I've been so pleased because it felt like real life writing this book, and the first one too. In both cases, there were a couple of characters that in the writing became more important to both of us, that we wanted them to mean something that we didn't think they would mean when we started.
Right.
And I think what we wanted to do it in a way that reinforced, not undermined or confused the story we were trying to tell. So I hope we did it.
Well, Lee seems to think that you did, and everybody who's able today to buy your book will obviously think you did. Lee, there's a weird parallel here in that when we get back together in October 25th, we're going to be talking about how it is for you to be writing with another author, your brother.
Yeah, and it's awful. So
well, if you really want to know the truth, no, I'm kidding.
It's
well, thank you. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. It's really been an honor and a delight to be able to share today with you, which is your publication day. So thank you, President Clinton. Thank you, Jim Patterson, and thank you, Lee Child, for being our host. And thank everyone. I want to thank everyone who's joined us this evening. There will be a podcast of this event available tomorrow when my husband gets around to getting to the audio portion of the Zoom. And this will live forever on our Facebook Live page. So if you know anyone who has missed this event, please recommend that they go to the Poison Pen Facebook video page. You don't have to belong to Facebook to watch it. So gentlemen, I hope we might get to do this again. If you do indeed find a story that interests you enough to do a third collaboration, because I'm sure the pressure is on already that you should do.
We already had some wise guy suggesting the president's cat, but I think we'll avoid that.
Oh, well, there are bound to be great stories out there. You just have to discover them, right? Just like you have to find a really good book to get a child to read it. In any case, good night, everybody. Thank you very much
Barbara.
for joining us.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
President.
you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.